next up is we have discussion, and the superintendent is going to lead this discussion on Every Student Succeeds Acts Plan. So this is an informational portion. There'll be a time for questions and answers, and I won't accept any motions at this time until after the presentation and discussions are complete.
Okay. All right. I think, can you hear us okay? It's just not very, here we go. All right. So during the discussion period, if you will indulge us by going through a deck of slides, and we have two sections to this. So the first is addressing the language around calculation rates, basically, and the language that we submitted that is in question. And then the second part is something we're bringing to you around the English language indicator that we haven't discussed before, but we feel like if we're going to make an amendment, it would be really timely to do so with this portion as well.
So can you get through that one section and then,
so we'll stop.
then let me know?
We'll take the first section and then we'll pause for questions, commentary, and then, if that's all right, Chair, we'll move to the second section.
Okay.
Okay?
But to follow our agenda, we'll move on, and then motions and everything will happen at the conclusion. Okay, very
Okay.
good. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so there are two items really related to the indicators within this accountability system. So we're going to talk briefly about both the achievement indicator and the English learner indicator as mentioned. The only provision that was in question basically is governing this achievement indicator and how it's calculated. So I want to be clear that there was never any danger of us losing money or not getting our plan approved around our participation rate of 95%. And I think that was a little bit of confusion and a misnomer that was out there in the public, that our current opt-out rate, while it might be higher than the 95%, there was no danger of withholding money or our plan because of that. It was really all about calculation. So we want to dig into that a little bit and explain it. So this current plan language is in front of you, and you also have this in board docs. So I don't want to read through it verbatim, but basically it's talking about how we propose to calculate the achievement indicator in accordance with ESSA. And as you're probably aware, Florida just got their plan approved as well. So all 50 states, 51 when we count DC, they have all had their plans approved now. And to our knowledge, there's nobody that was able to really get out of this piece of it around how the indicator was determined. And remember that we were trying to use language that allowed us to stay with one plan. But by using this language, we felt like it would give the board some wiggle room to either make some decisions in rule or about how we reported the federal calculation rate. So this is in the current plan, and let's just talk about the implications of this. So there are two main implications. One is, again, how we report it, and then secondly, how we identify schools for federal school improvement. So I want to give credit to Tiffany. I think she's done a really nice job of laying this out. You did this, didn't you? Yeah, and I think it really illustrates it. So I know it's a little small, but again, you've got this on your screen in front of you. So counting non-tested students as zeros for federal accountability calculations means that the student achievement indicator calculations reported by federal accountability will be lower for schools with those that less than 95% participation. And that's where we didn't want that confusion, and trying to stay within the state law that allows for parents to opt out while kind of still having one system. So let's just show how this might play out. So if you look at our current methodology, let's say that we have a school that has 120 students in the school. And of those 120, there are 100 that are assessed. That's that 100 in the green that you see. And then of the 100 students that were assessed, let's say that 65 of those students scored at proficient or above. So that would mean that our proficiency rate would be 65% in that school of 120 students. Now, the ESSA methodology that is required with a 95% in the denominator, think again, 120 students, but we have to calculate around 95% of the enrolled students. So again, let's say that 65 students of the 114 that we would have to count scored proficient or above. But in this case, because of the denominator being 95%, the proficiency rate would be 57%. So you can see the difference between our state accountability system and the federal, the ESSA methodology, right? So that's implication one. Now, here's how we would report that. We could simply report the federal calculation by adding in a column to a spreadsheet. And also, I think it's important to remember that proficiency is not the whole accountability system. That is just 25% of the high school's overall accountability score and 37% of an elementary's overall score. So if you just look at how we would play this out, we would just add in another column and show an additional calculation for the federal rate. So again, the second implication is that we then identify schools for federal school improvement. And remember that ESSA requires us to identify the lowest 5% of Title I schools for comprehensive support and improvement. So if you look at this diagram, you think about all of the schools in our state accountability system, and then for ESSA in the federal, there are Title I schools that we look at, and then we look at the lowest 5%. And so then the schools that would really be affected by the implication of the calculation rate of 95%, we think it would come down to an N size of about 5 schools. So if you think macro, all schools in our state accountability and Title I, then those lowest 5, the 5% of the lowest 5%, I'm not saying that correctly, the lowest performing 5%. And then within that, those that would be calculated based on participation rates. Okay. All right. So implication 2, again, identification of these schools for school improvement. I think this is where we need to spend a little bit of time because sentences 2 and 3, I believe, caused some of the greatest confusion. So what we were trying to do was to address what happens to a school when they're identified because of the methodology. And the underlying assumption of what we wrote is that a school shouldn't be treated the same based on their participation rates versus those who were just identified for proficiency. Okay, so there's the participation rate issue and then the proficiency issue. So I didn't say that correctly. Would you? I'm looking at Tiffany because I was ill. I was home with the flu yesterday. So my mind's a little bit foggy. When it's here, it is not coming out here correctly.
Well, and this is very nuanced. But essentially, those last 2 sentences of the plan, and maybe I'll go back to those really quick, is that addressing what happens to the schools that are identified for federal school improvement because of applying the ESSA calculation methodology. Are they treated in the same way as a school that is identified, that doesn't have low participation rates, that didn't affect their score. And initially, the thought was, and the underlying assumption of that language was, that the school improvement activities would be targeted at they would only be required to address the reason for which they were identified. And that, in this case, is because of low assessment participation. And that they shouldn't necessarily have to go through the same school improvement activities, and that they shouldn't necessarily be prioritized for school improvement resources either.
You wouldn't want to be spending resources on schools that for opt-out reasons.
Mm-hmm. And so, but there were a couple of words in there that caused a lot of confusion. That word of audit and that word of remediation. And there wasn't language clarifying that any of those activities would only be limited to what is authorized to not affect a parent's ability to opt out of statewide assessments. So that you would still be in compliance with state law with any activities that you would be requiring the school to undertake to improve participation rates. So there wasn't really enough language probably to make that clear.
And if I can just speak to the audit piece, that came from a conversation also asking what we were doing around participation rates. And the audit committee had just had a conversation about we're going to audit those with high participation rates to see the why. And in discussing that with the department, they felt like that word audit could stay general and that the board would determine what that looked like. So to Tiffany's point, we didn't have enough language in there to explain it. And we were leaving that up to you, but it did cause a lot of confusion in the field. So in other words, I take ownership for putting that, that word in there. But while in our mind it was general, I think it did limit and confuse people.
So do we want to get into the clarifying?
Yeah, so moving on then, so there are ways to deal with this. Again, you saw that the current language, and then we could also amend the plan. And we have a proposal to revise the language and to clarify this. So if you'll indulge me while I read it, just for those that may not be able to see it and may not be able to access the document online. So here's our proposed language. And again, we're open to any amendments to this or anything, but it was really just trying to capture the conversations that we've had with you and then place it in front of you for discussion. Chair, did you have a question or comment?
Well, I thought we had somebody with a question regarding a slide, but we're good to have you continue.
Okay. So we would propose the following, again, open to any amendments to this. Utah law authorizes a parent to excuse a student from taking a statewide assessment. And you see the code there. Compliance with this provision of state law makes it impossible for the State Board of Education to ensure compliance with the 95% requirement. However, as required by ESSA, the achievement indicator calculations for federal accountability will differ from the state calculations. Specifically, Utah will calculate the achievement indicator in accordance with ESSA section as follows, effectively counting non-tested students in excess of 5% as non-proficient for purposes of accountability and identification of schools for support and improvement under ESSA. The achievement indicator is one indicator within accountability system that accounts for 25% of a high school's overall accountability score and 37% of an elementary or middle school's overall accountability score. Because state law conflicts with the 95% achievement indicator calculation requirement in the particular section, complying with this requirement means that accountability scores calculated for federal accountability will differ from accountability scores calculated for state accountability, essentially bifurcating our accountability system for reporting purposes and school improvement identification. So that last line is really important, that it bifurcates it based on reporting purposes and school improvement identification, not two completely separate plans. Hope that makes sense.
Okay, we're not taking any motion or anything. This is your pause moment for this section for board member questions or comments. And we have a question or comment from Vice Chair Ellis. I apologize. I'm looking at the screen. I'm using this.
That's
so
fine.
Hopefully we can get through this. But it's important that everything that we have going on is on a live mic. So.
Okay, and I have questions on 3 slides. Is that okay? So on slide 6, I just have a
Let's wait till you get slide 6 up so we can follow.
which is,
So it's right before. the
it's
one right before
reporting.
that.
It's the implication one. I don't know that it really has to do with the slide. It's just that's when the question popped into my head. So if we were not to put in a proposal for an amended plan, is there anything stopping us from doing this bifurcation without telling them? So we could still do that if we chose not to ask the federal government permission to do so.
That's correct. In fact, the slide right after this that shows the spreadsheet, you could just do this exact same thing without changing the language.
Without changing the language. And then on the slide in front of it, you have the methodology of ESSA with the 95% enrolled. What if a school district had, I'm going to use one of the, not a school district, but one of the bigger examples where they had a 50% opt-out rate.
Mm-hmm.
What would that look like in this reporting?
So you'd still have to use the 95% as the denominator.
Right. So you just take
Regardless of how many
95%
kids are
of all
tested.
students, and then, so that's just the denominator.
So their proficiency rate then, because you'd have to be counting those in that participation rate, would be
Okay.
much lower.
And also for clarity's sake, when we're talking about reporting, we're not talking about sending a report to the federal government.
No.
This is just something that we're required to post publicly for public consumption.
Correct.
Correct. Okay, and then on slide 8, looking at this, the smallest circle due to low assessment participation rate, and later you talk about this is only a small portion of the overall achievement indicator. Do we have to use that as part of our indication for turnaround, or can we not include this low participation rate as one of our mechanisms for identifying a school?
So if you look outside of the yellow circle, the
Yes.
next circle is the 5% of
Right.
lowest performing Title I, and that's where you look at targeted support. If it's for participation rate, then that's where the board, you could look at something in rule or determine how you want to.
Yes, but my question is, are we required to do something about
To add them
participation
in.
rate?
We do, but I don't, that's up to you how we do
Yeah.
that.
So for state turnaround, that state turnaround program, we will not use this achievement indicator calculation requirement. Nor will we for the school report cards that are produced for the state, or school grades if that's what continues. But we are required to use the accountability system to designate schools for federal school improvement, and part of the accountability system is the achievement indicator, and part of the achievement indicator is the
Is the
requirement
participation
to count 95% in the denominator.
But are there additional mechanisms we can use to make sure that we aren't funneling
Yes.
money to a school that
that's what
doesn't
you would
really
decide.
need it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the term audit, I understood the explanation of why that was in the original application, but are we required to do any type of auditing of participation rates?
No, they do have to do a needs assessment.
Right, so it would just be something similar to the needs assessment that we conduct for all other schools that are identified for school improvement.
And one other follow-up question, if I may, this is my last one.
Okay. We have
And-
some other questions too, so.
Right.
Okay.
And also, since I won't get to talk after you answer me, I just wanted to thank you and thank the board for letting us have this discussion, because there was a lot of misconceptions out in the public, and I think that this is a valuable public discussion so that clarity could be had, so I appreciate that. But now I lost my last one.
Okay.
Really quick, sorry, I remembered it.
Okay, go ahead.
So, if we were to continue to rise in opt-outs, is there money on the line? No.
It's all in the calculation.
It's just all in the calculation, and so there's not necessarily a need to incentivize participation.
Not as far as losing,
Funding.
as funds being at risk federally.
Thank you.
Okay. We have a couple others, I believe. Board Member Belknap, did you have a question? Okay, and then on deck is Board Member Lear. We're going to the old primitive system, kind of, sort of, so appreciate your patience. Board Member Belknap.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so I'm trying to get some clarity here. And so what you read on the proposed revised clarifying language, that 5%, if a school had more than 5% opt-out, 5% of those students will still be considered a zero, and then not more than that?
I don't think based on what you said.
Not quite. It's just essentially any school that has higher than any school that has higher than a 5% opt-out, but so lower than 95% participation rate would be affected by this, because you would need to include at least 95% of enrolled students in the denominator.
It's always thinking 95%
Back to
in the
this.
denominator, regardless of how many you have opt out, it's always the 95%.
Chair, may I?
Yeah, follow up.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. So then, on implication number 2, under option number 2, it says to provide other clarifications. Are the other clarifications done in the proposed revised clarifying language? Yes. So that is taking that. I love this. Thank you so much for this bifurcated opportunity.
Okay, Board Member Lear, we're going to pass that mic on that side.
Or
So,
can I just use this one?
yep, that's the one to use.
Okay.
It's the only one
Thank
that's
you.
going to work on that side of the room.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know. I'm trying to just figure out what this language is, who it's supposed to convince. If it's necessary to be really strong to convince the federal government, or if it's supposed to be more exactly accurate, or if it's trying to more split the baby so that there's not certain people aren't bothered, but the federal government is satisfied. Can you help me with that?
We feel like this language clarifies what the methodology that we would be using and the purpose behind that methodology. Whereas before, if you understood our system and the state system and what we were trying to do, maybe you could read all of that, but it's our belief that this language clarifies how we would go about engaging in the calculation and how our state law and federal law differ.
And can I follow up with that?
Yeah.
For
Let's get a follow-up.
a 20-second? Because some of the things just strike me as sort of words that if I were reading this as the federal government or just accuracy words. Something like state law makes it impossible for the State Board of Education. And I feel like it's not impossible, it's very difficult, or it's more complicated or something like that. And maybe those words don't matter, and tell me if they don't. But to me, it feels like there are a couple of other places. Now I've lost it. But it just seems to me that it could be softened a little bit so that the explanation is, in my mind, more accurate and a little less inflammatory. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I hear what you're saying. As we worked with the federal government, and I think we stuck impossible in there in part because as we tried to work through all of this and have one plan, we found it impossible to do so.
Okay.
So, that word was
You feel like it is
intentional.
necessary.
And there are other plans that have used that language as well.
Okay. I'll just defer to you. It just kind of concerned me because it felt like if I was a federal bureaucrat reading this, I would say it feels so absolute when my understanding of it is a little more nuanced and complicated than that. But if you're trying to communicate that way to the feds, then I appreciate that too. So, thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up or anything, so can we move to or comments, can we move to the next slide or your next section, please?
No. Thank you, board members. So moving on to the English learner indicator, we want to bring an issue to you related to this indicator within the school accountability system. So for the English learner indicator, and you can see the chart there, points are allocated based on the percentage of English learners who demonstrate adequate progress towards English language proficiency. And it's measured by the WIDA assessment that I think you're all familiar with. Based on the feedback from various stakeholder groups, staff recommended seeking an amendment to the state plan to address the method for making sure that we determine adequate progress accurately. So points are allocated, if you want to go back there a little bit. So points are allocated, again, based on those who demonstrate the progress. And I just want to make sure that you see, again, that it's one of the indicators in the overall accountability system. Okay. So amending this definition, it would take it from achieving a score that's 0.4 proficiency levels higher than the previous year's score to one, again, of looking at individual growth targets, but it's based on the student's grade level and English proficiency level when the student entered school. And so you can see that difference. It's not about where they were the year before, but you have to take into account these two factors, which tend to be really strong predictive factors in a student's, not their ability necessarily, but they're more predictive of a student's growth in learning or in achieving proficiency with English. So I think we feel, I don't know if you feel the urgency, but we feel a little bit of urgency in sticking this in, because if we're going to amend the plan, we want to get this right. This is a new measure in our overall accountability plan, and we feel it would be detrimental if we said, well, this year we're going to use this 0.4 from the previous year's, showing growth from their previous year's baseline score. And then next year, we're going to try and change that and amend it. We just want to get it right in the first place and move it forward with an amendment.
Okay.
Especially with a new assessment, et cetera, et cetera. Just the time to do it.
Tiffany, did you have something to add before I take?
Oh yeah, just to supplement it, what we saw when we modeled the data and when schools started looking into modeling it and how it was going to play out is that using that one size fits all of 0.4 proficiency levels, it's much easier for elementary schools to get the points for this indicator than it is for high schools. It's much harder to achieve that proficiency level. So it's not very equitable across grade levels. So that's one of the main reasons why we want to move to this individualized approach.
Okay, we have a few questions. Board Member Reby.
This is the demographic we struggle with the most. So I would like you to make me sure that this is helping us be more directed towards this group of students, because it looks like it's less measurable and more wiggle room, and I don't like that. I want it to be very robust. I want us to really be putting as many resources to this, and this is where we fall down the most. So if you can assure me that this is really where we're going to have a lot of targeted resources, or how we're going to make these gains, I would like to hear that, because this area concerns me the greatest.
Yeah, we're in total agreement with
Okay.
you. And so really this individualized approach of growth targets is more equitable. The other was not. And so it was sort of masking some of the things that were taking place. And so we want to pull that back and really look at individual growth targets. But we'll let Anne Michelle describe this to you, because she really worked on all of the modeling to see where we can have higher expectations, but make sure that it's equitable in terms of the students that we're really measuring.
Anne Michelle Neal, accountability specialist, and also WIDA assessment specialist as well. So I agree. This is a really important group of students that requires a lot of focus and a lot of intentional effort in creating supports. So moving from a 0.4 flat expectation for student improvement over their score from the prior year to what we're proposing is we are going to identify growth targets for each student independently based on the level that they were initially their English level proficiency initially, so the first year they were in Utah, and then their current grade. So that's going to create a matrix where you have their initial English language proficiency level on the one side, and then their current grade level across the top, and each student will fall within one of those cells. Every student will have an achievable yet rigorous target for a growth for that year in order for them to exit EL services, meaning they become proficient in English within 6 years. And these growth targets lead them along that pathway to becoming proficient within the expected amount of time so that they can continue on to be successful in school and not remain as long-term English learners. It's not displayed here, but it is a much more targeted and specific way of identifying a growth target for the individual student, and rather than one blanket expectation for every student, because English learners are all very different from one another. So we feel like individualized student targets is a much more defensible and better way to set growth targets for students that they will benefit the most from.
Do you have a follow-up, Board Member Reby?
I do. So as I look at our students in WIDA, they make different levels of growth at different points of their language acquisition. Do we have a good baseline for this, and is that how those individual targets are going to be ascertained?
Yes.
So it's going to be a commonality across the whole entire state where, depending on where they are in their acquisition, that's where their growth will be.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you.
If I can speak to that, we're using our historical data to look at trends for how long it takes English learners to attain proficiency in English to establish these growth targets. So the targets will be set on our own local norms and the students within our state.
Okay.
May I speak to that as well? I just think this is something unique and specific to, I don't know if it's unique, but it's definitely something specific that we think will really help us. We can lead out in this. It's, you used to be either in or out of services, and this is, think about if we only did SAGE or now RISE every 3 or 4 years and said, oh gosh, along the way, we don't know how well kids were doing, but 4 years later, they either got it or they didn't. And this provides us a way to really benchmark it along the way and look for patterns and things we need to do differently instructionally. So we think it will help instruction as well.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
If I understand correctly, students who are literate in their home language learn a second language more quickly than those who are not literate, strongly literate in their first language. So is that something that will be taken into account as well, or does that make it too cumbersome as far as the calculation?
That's not included in the calculation, but I think is reflected in their initial proficiency level, where the proficiency level that they score in the first time they enter school. If they have a strong background in their first language, their initial proficiency in English is likely to be impacted by that. And then also the speed at which they grow in English and attain English proficiency is improves as well. The research is pretty well established in that phenomenon in language acquisition. Is that clear?
Vice Chair Ellis.
Thank you. My question is pertaining to a different part of the plan that's not being discussed today. Out of Standards Committee, we have, I don't remember what rule, but it has to do with the N size used to calculate for alternative calculation measures. And then I was looking through, I was going to wait for this to be part of that discussion, but I was looking through our ESSA plan and noticed that there's an entire section on the history of the N size and other things. And so I'm trying to do more research there, but I am concerned that so as I understand it, the N size is 10, meaning only 10 students have to take the test in any given school to then demonstrate growth and proficiency. And I'm concerned about that not being a percentage of the amount of students enrolled in the school and just this number. And because if you have a large student population and you're measuring only 10 students, I mean, that would be pretty unlikely that we would get to that low of a participation rate. But I'm concerned that we're saying that would be an accurate measure of growth. And then we're not triggering any alternative measures. Anyway, so yes, an N size of 10 would be fine if you had a very small student body population, but if you had a large student body population, that's a very small percentage that you're then using to calculate and trigger these alternative methods of looking at calculations.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, so I think one way of looking at that, so we set an N size of 10. There's a lot of considerations when you're making that decision, and as far as transparency on one end of the spectrum and maximizing, not hiding student groups or not hiding the performance of certain small schools, things like that. But then on the other end, reliability and validity of the accountability determinations. But one way to, I would think, get at some of the proportionality issue that you're talking about, if you have really low participation rates, would be to address it from that perspective. So if a school has a really low participation rate, should we be subjecting them to an alternative form of accountability or coming up with some way to handle that type of situation? So I think there's a couple ways to look at it. You could do it in size or on the participation rate side of things.
Okay. It's not going to be addressed today. I just am looking into that.
Okay, we're kind of getting to the point of what I want to recognize Board Member Reeby. She has a question and that, but if we can just keep everything focused on where we're at on this whole ESSA, I think we're moving really close to going to the next section. So board members, if you have questions, comments, concerns, this will be the time to dive in, because when we hit, as soon as it pauses out, then we're going to go to proposed action. So Board Member Reeby, do you have, okay, your question or comment is important, so I don't want to run you off.
No, it's fine.
Okay, sorry. Okay, we're at that pause moment, so I guess I'll be moving to on the agenda to this ends the discussion portion, and moving into 7.2, any proposed action by way of motion. We'll try to capture them as best we can. Board Member Bolter.
So I move that staff seek an amendment to the ESSA state plan to clarify the 95% achievement indicator calculation issue, to acknowledge the inability to meet the 95% participation rate requirements due to state law, and to remove references to audits or remediation as suggested by staff. Basically, I just move for the staff suggested language.
So would you be okay if we stay with the staff's?
Yes, staff's language is perfect.
Okay. Okay, we have a motion, a second, a discussion. Vice Chair Brittany, comments?
I think the caution that we need to be careful for is if we, in motion, require that they go with staff suggested language. If there's a small tweak in verbiage, then it has to come back to the full board for approval. So if we give the very specific direction that's in the motion that's stated, then it gives them punctuation flexibility, things that might be simple, not in form, but just in making sure that it passes, that we can do that without a full board motion.
Yeah, we have it, and we have it on recorded here, and what's on their motion. So as this moves forward, as leadership, we'll have to follow up and make sure that it stays in compliance with, everything stays in compliance with the motion. Any further discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Voting was unanimous. Board Member Belknap?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion that we accept the staff's recommendation to amend the definition for adequate progress for our EL students. And do I need to say something else? And if they need little tweaks?
Yeah, will you repeat that again? Do you have it written down?
I do not, but to accept the staff's recommendation.
Hey, can I throw something out that
Yeah, throw it out.
that maybe a possible motion that you're trying to state there is that staff seek an amendment to the ESSA state plan to change the method of calculating the English learner indicator within the accountability system to individualize growth targets based on the student's grade level and English proficiency level when the student enters school. I think that's what you're trying to say.
Honestly, why did I push my button? Okay, that's my motion, Lorraine.
So we have a second. Okay, the motion, is there any discussion to the motion? Okay, I'll repeat the motion that the staff seek an amendment to the ESSA state plan to change the method of calculating the English learner indicator within the accountability system to individualize growth targets based on the student grade level and English proficiency level when the student enters school. Okay, we're going to put this to a vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Voting was unanimous. Thank you. Okay, we're trying to catch up on your board. I applaud you. You're doing a good job. We're getting it done.